Fiona had been standing on my front step for 4 minutes, holding a casserole dish covered in tinfoil, and she still hadn't rung the bell. I only knew because my kitchen window looks out onto the porch, and I'd been standing at the sink rinsing a coffee mug when I noticed her, just standing there, not checking her phone, not adjusting the dish, just standing there like she was deciding something that had nothing to do with whether or not to knock. I opened the door before she could. "How long were you going to wait out here?" I said. She looked up. I wasn't waiting. I was building resolve. For a casserole? It's shepherd's pie. She held it out. And yes, shepherd's pie requires resolve. That was Fiona. She had been my best friend for 5 years, and she still said things that made me stand in doorways trying to figure out if I'd missed the joke or if the joke was that there wasn't one. I let her in. She walked past me into the kitchen like she lived there, which she more or less did, in the way that people who have their own mug in your cabinet and know which drawer you keep the good scissors in sort of live somewhere without actually paying rent. "Your plant is dying," she said, setting the dish on the counter. "It's dormant. It's yellow. It's autumnal." She turned and looked at me with the expression she reserved for things she found genuinely tragic. "It's June, Adrian." That was also Fiona. She had shown up because my week had been the specific kind of bad that doesn't translate well over text. The kind where nothing catastrophic happened, just the long, slow grind of things going sideways. A project at work that fell apart 3 days before deadline. A landlord inspection that came with a very pointed comment about the state of my bathroom grout. And then my car making a sound on the 401 that I could not explain but that cost me $430 to fix. I told her about the car. She texted back a single question mark and then, 2 hours later, showed up with shepherd's pie. "You didn't have to do this," I said. "I know." She was already pulling 2 forks out of the drawer. I wanted to. We ate at the kitchen table with the tinfoil peeled back because neither of us wanted to dirty another dish. Outside, it was that gray late spring evening that southern Ontario does, where the light goes flat and the air smells like it's about to rain, but never quite does. Fiona had her hair up in the kind of knot that looked messy on purpose but probably took some effort, and she was wearing a flannel shirt I didn't recognize, which meant she'd been thrifting again. "New shirt," I said. "Value Village on Dundas. $2. It suits you." She looked down at it, then back at me. It was either this or a vest that said "Property of Muskoka Athletic Club," and I thought one of us had to maintain standards. I almost said something, I don't know what. Something about the way she said "one of us," like we were a unit so obvious it didn't need explaining. Something about the flannel and the shepherd's pie and the way she'd been standing on my porch building resolve at 7 on a Tuesday. I didn't say it. I never did. That was the problem. Fiona and I had met at a mutual friend's going-away party in a Kensington Market apartment that was too small for 30 people and had exactly 1 bottle of wine and an optimistic amount of beer. I'd been leaning against the wall near the window because the room was loud and I didn't know most of the people, and Fiona had appeared beside me, looked at the crowd, and said, "Do you ever go to parties just to remember why you don't like parties?" I said. "Every single time." She nodded like I'd confirmed something she'd suspected. Then she said, "I'm Fiona," and stole the spot of wall beside me and stayed there for the next 2 hours until we'd both decided we'd done our social duty and left to get shawarma on College Street at 11 at night because neither of us had eaten dinner. That was it. That was how it started. Shawarma and a mutual distaste for crowded rooms. After that came coffee, then walks along the waterfront that were supposed to be 30 minutes and turned into 2 hours. Then the texts. The "Are you awake?" texts that were never just about being awake. The calls on Sunday mornings when one of us had had a bad Saturday and needed somewhere to put it. She showed up when I had food poisoning and was genuinely useless, and she sat on my bathroom floor reading me Wikipedia articles about historical plagues because she said context made everything feel more manageable. I told her it did not make it more manageable. She read me another one. People assumed things. Of course they did. Her coworker asked her once if I was her boyfriend, and she said not technically, which she told me later like it was a funny story, and I laughed in the right place, but the not technically sat in my chest for longer than it should have. My brother asked me once, over Christmas dinner with my mother looking pointedly at her mashed potatoes, if Fiona and I were a thing. I said we were friends. He said, "Sure," in the tone people use when they think you're lying and they're too polite to say so directly, but not polite enough to drop it entirely. The thing I had never said out loud, not to my brother, not to anyone, was that Fiona was the only person I'd ever met who made me feel like being exactly the person I was had always been enough. No adjustments, no performance. She'd seen me at food poisoning level and still showed up with shepherd's pie. She'd sat on my bathroom floor reading about the Black Death because she thought it would help. She laughed at the right things and didn't laugh at the wrong ones, and she had never, not once in 5 years, made me feel like I was too much or not enough or in the wrong register entirely. Every time I had tried to date someone else, some part of my brain ran a quiet background process. A comparison I hadn't asked for and couldn't turn off. I never told her that. The shepherd's pie was good, better than good actually. Fiona was a specific kind of cook. Not someone who followed recipes so much as someone who treated cooking like an argument she intended to win. The mashed potatoes on top had edges that had gone golden in the oven, and there were peas in the filling that she put there despite knowing I had complicated feelings about peas and things. You put peas in it again, I said. They add color. I don't need color. I need filling. Color is filling for the soul. That is meaningless. It is also true. I ate the peas. I always did. That was probably information about me. After dinner we moved to the couch and she stole the throw blanket that lives over the armrest and wrapped it around herself without asking, which she had been doing since the second winter we'd known each other and which I had stopped registering as unusual approximately 4.5 years ago. She tucked her feet under her and held her mug in both hands and looked out the window at the gray evening. "Tell me about the project," she said. So I did. All of it. The scope changes, the client who'd kept moving the goalposts, the presentation that had landed with a sound like a tree falling on a quiet afternoon, my manager's face doing the thing faces do when they're trying to be supportive and not quite getting there. Fiona listened the way she always listened, which was completely, no half attention, no glancing at her phone. She asked one question in the middle that was sharp enough to make me stop and actually think. And then she said nothing for a moment, and then she said nothing for a moment, and then she said, "You did the work." The fact that they changed the brief 3 times isn't a reflection of the work. It feels like it is. I know, but it isn't. I believed her. That was the thing. I didn't believe it from myself, but I believed it from Fiona, and I had stopped questioning why that was because I suspected the answer would cost me something. Outside, it finally started raining. The sound of it came through the window I'd left cracked, soft and even, the kind of rain that's more sound than water. Fiona pulled the blanket higher, and I was very aware of how close we were sitting and how we had been this close 100 times, and I had always found a way to make it feel casual. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You usually do." She looked at her mug. "Why is it always you when something happens? Like the car, or the project. Why is it always you? I want to tell first." I didn't say anything. My brain scrambled to find a joke and came back empty. "That's a weird question," she said. "Forget I asked." "It's not a weird question." It felt weird the second it came out. "Fiona." She looked at me. "Why do you think?" I said. She opened her mouth, closed it, looked back at the window where the rain was making the streetlight blur at the edges. "I don't know. I've been trying to decide if it's just habit. 5 years is a long time. You build habits. That's one explanation. What's another one?" I set my mug down on the coffee table and leaned back and looked at the ceiling because looking at her felt suddenly like looking directly at something that needed safety equipment. I think some people just fit in the space you didn't know you had, and then they're there and the space closes around them and you stop being able to imagine what the room looked like before. Fiona was quiet for long enough that I looked back at her. She was watching me with an expression I couldn't fully read. Not the joke-incoming expression, not the thinking about something else expression, something else, something more open than she usually let her face be. "That's a very good way of putting it," she said carefully. "Thanks. I've had 5 years to think about it." That landed in the room and stayed there. Fiona looked at her mug again, set it down on the cushion beside her. "How long have you been thinking about it? Tell me in the comments. Would you have said something sooner? Or would you have waited the way I did, hoping the timing would eventually feel right?" I laughed once, a short sound that came out before I could stop it. "Longer than I should have." "How much longer?" "A lot longer." She turned to look at me properly. Her feet had come out from under the blanket at some point, and she was sitting facing me, and the throw was pulled around her waist, and she had a small mark on her collarbone from where the flannel collar had been sitting funny, and I noticed all of that in the space of half a second, because that was what happened when you've been paying attention to someone for 5 years. Adrian. She said my name like she was checking something. Like she was checking whether the ground was still solid. Yeah. Are you saying what I think you're saying? Probably. She pressed her lips together, not like she was holding back a laugh, like she was holding back something bigger than that. Okay, she said, because I need you to actually say it. I need you to actually say it. I need to hear the words. I turned toward her. Every time I try to be interested in someone else, there's this background thing. Running quietly. Comparing. And it's always you. You're the one I call first. You're the one I want in the room when something goes well, and also when everything goes sideways, and also when everything goes sideways, and also when absolutely nothing is happening and I just want someone there. I have spent a significant amount of energy pretending that was a normal thing to feel about a friend, and I'm not entirely sure I can keep doing that. The rain kept going outside. The streetlight through the window made everything in the room soft. Fiona looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, very quietly, "That flannel shirt cost $2, Adrian. I put on a $2 flannel shirt and drove across the city with shepherd's pie because your week was bad. Does that sound like something I do for everyone? You're generous. I am not that generous." Something in my chest unwound by about 30%. When did it start? For you. She thought about it, not evasively. Fiona wasn't evasive, she was just precise. She wanted to get it right. "Do you remember last November, the thing with my lease?" I remembered. Her landlord had decided not to renew her lease in October with 60 days notice, which in Toronto in November is the kind of news that lands like a structural failure. She'd called me in a panic and I'd driven over and we'd sat at her kitchen table until midnight going through listings on her laptop. And I'd found a 2-bedroom in Roncesvalles that was just inside her budget, and I'd called the number on the listing at 12:15 in the morning and left a message, and somehow it had worked, and she'd gotten the apartment. "You called a landlord at midnight," she said. "You didn't hesitate, you just did it." That wasn't I would have done that for anyone. Maybe. She picked at a thread on the blanket. But the way you sat with me while we looked. Like there was nowhere else you needed to be. Like this was exactly where you were supposed to be. She paused. I think I knew then. I think I'd known for a while before that. But that was the night I admitted it to myself. You didn't say anything. You didn't say anything either. That was entirely fair. I was scared, I said. You're the one part of my life that works without any maintenance. You're just there. And I thought if I said it wrong, or if you felt differently, I'd lose you. And I couldn't figure out which was worse, having you the way I had you, or not having you at all. I kept deciding the way I had you was enough. Fiona looked at me steadily. It wasn't enough for me either. I just also couldn't figure out what to do about it. Outside, a car moved slowly through the rain. Its headlights made a brief bright pass across the ceiling, and then were gone. "So," I said, "what do we do?" She tilted her head. "Is that an actual question?" "Because you're sitting 2 feet from me in your own living room. I'm trying not to be presumptuous, Adrian." She looked at me with something that was almost exasperation, and also entirely wasn't. "I drove across the city, in the rain, with a casserole. Shepherd's pie, with shepherd's pie. I think we are well past presumptuous." I closed the 2 feet between us. She didn't move back. She'd had the blanket up around her shoulders, and it slipped a little when I reached for her face, and I felt her exhale. Not sharp, not nervous, just a breath going out like something releasing. Her hand came up and found my arm just above the wrist, not pulling me forward, just holding on. The kiss was quiet. The room was quiet. The rain outside kept doing what it was doing, and the street light held steady, and somewhere outside, someone's recycling bin tipped over in the wind, and we both heard it, and neither of us pulled away. When we did, she stayed close. Her forehead came to rest against mine, and I could feel her breathing evening out. "Okay," she said. "Okay," I said. She stopped. "Yeah," she laughed. Small and real. I was going to say 5 years in the making, but that felt like the wrong thing to lead with. It's accurate. It's embarrassing, is what it is. Speak for yourself. I think I handled this with enormous grace and dignity. Fiona pulled back just far enough to look at me. "You told me the casserole dish required resolve. You said that about the shepherd's pie. I wasn't talking about the shepherd's pie. I stared at her. You were standing on my porch for 4 minutes building up to. I had been thinking about it in the car the whole way over, and in the grocery store. I bought the potatoes and the ground beef and I thought, this is the night. And then I got to your porch and I thought, what if it isn't? Fiona, don't. You brought a casserole it was a symbolic act. And also you needed dinner. I started laughing and I couldn't stop it. And she tried to hold her expression for about 2 seconds and then she couldn't hold it either. The laugh that came out of her was the real one, not the polite company one, the one that went all the way to her eyes and made her bunch her shoulders up. The rain kept coming down outside and the room was warm and the shepherd's pie dish was still on the counter and the blanket was half on the floor. We stayed on the couch for a long time after that, not doing anything dramatic. She picked the blanket back up and we talked about the project. And she told me about a conference she had coming up, and we argued about whether the diner on Roncesvalles or the one on Bloor had better breakfast and didn't resolve it. Which was fine, because we'd been not resolving it for 3 years and it had never once stopped us from going to both. At some point, she fell asleep, just quietly, in the way she sometimes did when she'd had a long week, head tilting to the side, breathing slowing down. I'd seen her fall asleep on my couch before. This wasn't different exactly. Except that I didn't immediately start looking for a reason to make it feel less significant. I just let it be what it was. I sat there and listened to the rain and thought about midnight lease calls and $2 flannel shirts and a person who'd showed up on my porch with a casserole dish and stood there building resolve. And I thought about how I had been sitting across from that person for 5 years calling it friendship because I couldn't figure out what to do with the size of it. The following Saturday, we went to the Bloor Diner. We'd been to this one probably 60 times. The same booth, by the window, with the cracked vinyl seat that neither of us ever chose to sit in. And the server who'd worked weekend mornings there so long she knew we'd want coffee before we sat down. She brought 2 mugs without asking, set them down in front of us, looked at Fiona, then at me. You two finally figure it out, she said. Fiona looked at her coffee. I looked at mine. We're working on it, I said. The server made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sigh and went back to her other tables. Fiona lifted her mug and held it in both hands the way she always did and looked out the window at the Saturday morning street. The TTC buses moving through the intersection, the guys selling plants outside the hardware store down the block, the whole ordinary, irreplaceable morning. Working on it, she repeated. Too slow, she considered. I think it's accurate. She looked at me over the rim of her mug. We've always been accurate, just delayed. Better late, significantly better late. She stole a piece of my toast before it had fully arrived at my side of the table, which she had been doing for 5 years, and I did not say anything about it, because some things didn't need to change. I just stopped pretending I hadn't noticed.